So this is our introduction to science fiction and subcreation. That's what I've called this course. It is an introduction to the writing of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And as it says in the little blurb, the course description, it is addressing various issues that, if you were with me last semester in the C.S. Lewis class, we saw concerned Lewis as well. One of them is the strong sense of human alienation that blights the 20th century and has been variously described as disenchantment. That's the fashionable term in our day, the sense that the universe and the world and everything in it is merely a material entity to be understood through empirical science and all of its reductionism. Or at the opposite end is to be understood spiritually without any mooring in the material physical world. Those two extremes, the wholly spiritual and the wholly material, are actually reflections of a loss of the Christian view of nature and the Christian view of human nature, for that matter. And they play themselves out in the culture of the Western world and have done, my argument goes, ever since the 17th century. You can see it in Descartes' philosophy of the cogito, where he describes, you remember if you go back to Descartes and the problem that Descartes addresses, which is the loss of a sense of reality around him and certainty, which he addressed through the method of doubt. Remember, it was a thought experiment. I am going to paraphrase something that he never said, but the thinking process is the world of intellectual certitude has collapsed. I can't even be certain of the fact that the planets circle around the Earth anymore, because Mr. Galileo has demonstrated with his telescope that everything orbits around the sun. And when he does that, he is not just addressing an issue of cosmology. There's all sorts of things that are tethered to that in the humanities and in the natural sciences that are compromised along with it, because it becomes a framework that everything is rightly ordered within, including the humanities. The word in terms of grammar and dialectic or logic and rhetoric, that's tethered with those three subjects of the quadrivium or of the trivium rather are connected with the quadrivium, of which astronomy is one of the subjects, but so is music, and so is geometry, so is arithmetic for that matter. And it's not accidental that mathematics is also one of the subjects that Descartes explores intensely, as does Isaac Newton and others. And they come up with different ways of addressing geometry, for instance. And they, well, why geometry? Because geometry is connected to astronomy. It's the same intellectual framework that is being addressed there. And the end effect of that, without getting into the deep weeds here, is the problem of the disenchantment of the universe and of human nature, for that matter, the removal of the idea that God is involved in the not only in the creation of the universe, but in the daily regulation and action of the universe, but also that we bear his image, and that we are therefore not just physical beings and emotional beings, but also spiritual beings. All of those things are denied in the 20th century, and we live in the light of that denial to this day. Case in point, the idea of gender identity is posited on the idea that sexual characteristics, which are empirically observable, and in fact you can speak to it down to the level of genetics, are nonetheless denied by the spiritualizing gender identity crowd. They'll just say that the sexual material reality that we observe has no relation to who I am as a person. That's a radical spiritual take on human nature. Totally divorced from the material. It says the material is the body in which we were born, and the language is literally, we assign an identity at birth. But that's not my identity, I identify myself. And it's literally a version of the Cartesian cogito, I think, therefore I am. In this case, I think about my own sexual identity, and therefore that is my identity, but it has no relation to the material entity that is my body. So it's a disembodied sense of self. It's just a further iteration of the problem that Lewis and Tolkien are addressing in their sci-fi work, and I think you will find even in Lewis's, not just Lewis's, but Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. I'll address that as well, but they're addressing a common concern. On the other hand, there are those that want to reduce the whole world to the material world. That reductionist sort of materialism, which characterizes so much of empirical science in the 19th and the 20th century, such that the humanities and the sciences get pushed into two opposite camps. The humanities are considered to be spiritual sciences. In German, it's called Geisteswissenschaften, Geist being the word in German for spirit, and the humanity, or in the sciences, in the Naturwissenschaften, the natural sciences. And the natural sciences follow a process of empirical observation and making certain on the basis of what we see materially and evidentially. The spiritual sciences, on the other hand, have no such physical component. And so with that, there's a subjectivity and a relativism that is posited to reside in the humanities that is not there in the so-called hard sciences. The hard sciences follow the materialist path. The humanities follow the spiritual path. And both of them are divorced from a view of reality that connects the two and can explain the reality of the two things that every human being historically recognizes in their religious expressions. And we addressed that last semester when we looked at Lewis's The Abolition of Man, which we'll look at again on this course. The idea that human nature, and specifically our moral awareness, is an aspect of our human nature, and that doesn't have a materialist cause. And yet it is as certain to human beings as anything they know around them. They're absolutely certain of the idea of injustice, specifically when they experience it. They deny it when they perpetrate it. That's another clue to another problem, but again, last semester I talked about how Lewis addressed that in his work, Mere Christianity. He began with that moral problem of the experience of injustice, which we observe with such certainty that children will complain to other children on the playground that that's not fair, that's wrong. And they expect the other child to understand it because the other child does understand it. So it's an absolute certitude that every human being operates under. And yet, Lewis says that our age is so benighted that it denies that reality. And if that is the case, then he says what we are really doing is abolishing man and human nature. And that has consequences in terms of education, in terms of politics, in terms of social relations, in terms of psychology. There's all manner of implications of this. So last semester, as I say, I addressed this in my first foray looking at Lewis. I did not deal with the material I'm going to deal with on this course, which is more specifically primed to the problem of scientism. And if you're interested in a book on this, I think this is a really useful one called The Magician's Twin, C.S. Lewis on Science, Scientism, and Society. It's a collection of essays put out by the Discovery Institute from various scholars And I find it rather helpful. It's a little dated now, but not that dated. The problem remains the same, such that the certitude that Descartes was concerned with, namely the authority of the authorities, I can't trust what Aristotle says. I can't trust what the church says, because the new science of Galileo contradicts what the church says on astronomy. It's not just that he has a different view. He says, my view is absolutely certainly right, and yours is absolutely certainly wrong. And I can prove it with my telescope. At that point, the authority of the church is gone. He's challenging the authority. And the implications of it are vast. Remember, I'm teaching a course on Milton this semester. Milton visited Galileo under house, where he was under house arrest, and talked to him about that. That's sort of the context of the great era of English literature as well. That era of challenges to authority, and yet authority also being asserted in a different way by the foremost Christian intellects. And I'm taking Milton as the prime example of that. He's asserting God's providence and justifying the ways of God to men, even though it appears in his age that all authority has been undermined on the scientific realm. So he'll have to deal with that. But this course is going to deal with this, and it's going to be a response to a contemporary problem. And I don't want to get into politics too much. You might think I was touching on gender identity. I'm just talking about that's an implication of all this. And Lewis and Tolkien, by engaging in science fiction, are engaging in what is actually a political genre. It has contemporary consequences. It has always been so. So science fiction as a genre is a late 18th, I would say early 19th century genre. You could argue that it goes back to the 18th century. But it is the problem, science fiction deals with the problem of life if science is given its druthers and given full sway over human nature. What will result from this? You could say that Swift's modest proposal was an exploration of that. What if we reduce human beings to their worth on the market? Think about it in purely material and monetary consequences. What if we reduce human nature to that? So much value and cost, and do a cost-benefit analysis, which is part of a philosophy that later comes to be known as pragmatism, which is a thoroughly immoral way of looking at life. It's not that pragmatism or the consideration of cost and benefit is wrong, but as the governing structure of moral rectitude, it just effectively means that there is no limit on injustice as long as there's a benefit financially. We will see a representation of that in the figure of divine in Lewis's sci-fi trilogy. He is only interested, he's a businessman who's interested in the financial benefits of colonization of the other planets. And if you meet extraterrestrials there, again, if we have to wipe them all out to gain benefit, who cares? He certainly doesn't. And we'll meet a scientist that goes along with him. So again, the two representatives that Lewis has going out into what it will be called outer space are representatives of a certain type of individual. So they're not just names that he invents. They represent a certain type of thinking that governs the considerations of all such matters. And he decides to put it in outer space. Well, because the genre of science fiction is already addressing those issues. And so we'll see that one of our first works, or two of them, Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus and H.G. Wells' The First Man in the Moon, are already raising the issues that Lewis and Tolkien will weigh in on. but they present it from a non-Christian vantage point. Mary Shelley raises the issue of Paradise Lost by having the monster read Paradise Lost and dealing with the issue of human nature, which arises because of the creation of the Frankenstein monster. What does it mean to be human? What are the responsibilities that scientists have towards their fellow human beings? What are the implications of seizing the power of creation of another entity? What are the bioethical considerations of that? Because she's just pursuing it as a thought experiment, even though it's a part of Gothic horror fiction. But she's pushing it into the realm of the scientist there. Likewise, H.G. Wells, the famous novelist in The First Men in the Moon, is doing the same thing. I chose this particular book because it has an explicit reference in Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet. He's clearly thinking of this book when he writes Out of the Silent Planet. And you'll see that immediately. And all of the connotations, not just the characters and the sort of the plot setting, but even the experience of outer space, which Wells describes from a certain atheist materialist vantage. Lewis is going to approach from a enchanted Christian medieval worldview. He's going to give it a different framework, a different way of looking at it, a different way of thinking about it. He's helping us think as an alternative to the dogma of the day. For all of its claim to be opposed to authority, there is a single-minded and reductionistic and authoritarian view of reality that he finds in his contemporaries around us. And I will say further on that front that the threat of that becomes very real to both Lewis and Tolkien because of the context in which they write. The First and the Second World War. Extraordinary times. The possibility of human extinction. Never imaginable before on Earth. But now it's imaginable. If you've seen Christopher Nolan's movie recently on the atom bomb. What was it called again? What's that? Oppenheimer, yeah. It deals with this in a certain way. It's addressing it at any rate. And the threat of the bioethical, political, all of the issues raised by the power that comes from the creation of the atom bomb and the ability to not just defeat your enemies, but annihilate them. That sort of power. And what are the limits on that power then? How do we consider it? Well, those are the considerations that Lewis and Tolkien, that's the intellectual ferment of the Second World War. So I'm going to, just as a way of opening the talk here, I'm going to read an extract from this book here by Alan Jacobs, The Year of Our Lord, 1943, Christian Humanism in an Age of Crisis. When I studied literature, and it'll be the same for you in high school and university for that matter, there was a tendency to present certain writers as representatives of the 20th century. And it was not Lewis or Tolkien, by the way. Never. Not even mentioned. Not read. I don't know if that was the case with you, but it depends on your school. But the public school system that I was raised in the 70s and 80s did not mention Lewis or Tolkien, even though both authors are among the most popular writers of the 20th century, voted so, by the way, in the year 2000, and the most significant to this day. Like, people read them and think that they're profound, and they say something very consequential about our contemporary experience of life. They're not ever read in schools. How come? And my contention, and this just is I guess a hypothesis, but I think it's a hypothesis that is borne out by a fairly reasonable assessment of the facts on the ground, is that view of life is one that the establishment doesn't want to hear or have heard by people. Because if they did, they might question the way in which they're being directed. And if you want to add a layer to it, which I'm happy to do as well, there's also a spiritual dimension. If we are in fact in a spiritual world, and there are such things as demons, and we are in the world where where the devil reigns, there's a decided spiritual interest in preventing that truth from being heard. And even though it's been published and has been popular, we can reduce its impact by throttling its spread, its publication, just like our tech people have done recently on social media. We can reduce that by controlling it. So if you control the public school system, then you can control what's read there, and therefore what's going to influence people and cause them to think about what the reality in which they are living actually is. So from Jacob's The Year of Our Lord 1943, he chooses 1943 because 1943 is a time when there was something called a Casablanca Conference. And the Casablanca Conference was one in which various of the Allies met and thought about what they were going to do in the event that they defeated Hitler and the Axis powers, right in the middle of 1943, an era of hot war, right in the middle of that. Remember, war had already been declared on the US. The US has been pulled into it as well. Roosevelt is meeting with Churchill and with, I guess, who else would have met there? Whatever representatives of the French would be there as well. But Roosevelt, in the public proclamations there, spoke of the inevitable disaster for the Axis powers, and not just for the Germans. And I quote, "There are many roads which lead right to Tokyo," Roosevelt said. "We shall neglect none of them." Most telling of all was Roosevelt's insistence that official statements from the conference include the proclamation that the Allies demanded nothing less than the, quote, "unconditional surrender of the Axis powers and would not end the war on any other terms." So it was an absolute total war and would be fought at all cost to the elimination of its allies or their unconditional surrender. Total war with an absolute commitment to total defeat of its enemies. Now, and I'm just going to read this, and I'm going to read it because it includes so much information I think is helpful background here, which you will otherwise read nothing about, and I'm putting Lewis and Tolkien in that framework, although he does not mention Tolkien in The Year of Our Lord 1943 because Tolkien doesn't publish anything in 1943, although Lewis does. But there are other Christian thinkers who are responding to the backdrop of atheist humanism and the control of the education political framework, and they're going to address things in a way that the Casablanca Conference doesn't. By the way, the Casablanca Conference is the establishment, and there are Christians amongst the establishment, but they're mainstream, mainline denominations, what we would call liberal Christians. So let me read. So they're totally confident, the Allies, and Jacobs makes this comment. One result of this newly absolute confidence, the Allied leaders had, of course, long prophesied victory, but not in such uncompromising terms, was that on the home front, thoughts began to turn to life after war. What kind of world would be left to us when the Axis powers had suffered that, quote unquote, inevitable disaster? There would be much remaking and reshaping to do. Who would do it? And what principles would govern them? Such thoughts were on the minds of many, and some of the more ambitious and provocative ideas emerged from a small group of Christian intellectuals. This was a time, it seems so long ago now, a very different age, and one that is unlikely to return, when prominent Christian thinkers in the West believed that they had a responsibility to set a direction, not just for churches, but for the whole of society. And stranger still, in that time, many of their fellow citizens were willing to grant them that authority, or at least to listen when they asserted it. Now I say that I'm going to interrupt myself here a little bit. Note that in our day, that prominent atheist thinkers, among others, Richard Dawkins and others who are prominent critics of everything Christian, are suddenly saying we need at least something like Christianity, Christendom, in order to govern the West, because otherwise we're in serious trouble. We are totally, the establishment has no ability to confront the problems that we see around us all the time. So there's a place for that. Same, at least the atheists who recognize the value of Christianity are making that judgment. I don't see many Christians coming to the fore and speaking to that, but nonetheless, it is a similar sort of time of great shaking and a great threat, I would say. Anyway, back to this. Boswell, the famous biographer of Samuel Johnson, tells us that Dr. Johnson once said, "Depend on it, sir, when a man knows he is to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully." End quote. Throughout the world, a similar concentrating of minds had been intensifying for some years, beginning no later than Hitler's rise to power in 1933. But it was in early 1943 that this intensification of focus produced some especially remarkable work. Now he gets to the 1943. So while the Casablanca conference is going on with the politicians, there's a group of Christian intellectuals who are writing and addressing something similar. And now he gets to this. In the months following the Casablanca conference, Christianity and Crisis, the magazine founded in 1941 by Reinhold Niebuhr, liberal theologian, writes a book on Christ and Culture, called Christ and Culture, and his colleagues at Union Seminary published a series of articles endorsing and explaining a document called, quote, 6 Pillars of Peace, unquote. The document itself had been produced by an organization called the Federal Council of Churches Commission on a Just and Durable Peace, chaired by John Foster Dulles, then Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to Republican presidential candidate Thomas E. Dewey. Don't mistake him for John Dewey. No relation, as far as I know. The emphasis of this document and of the responses to it in Christianity in Crisis was on the creation of a body of international lawmaking to replace the failed League of Nations, autonomy for nations then under occupation, and a repudiation of the draconian and punitive measures taken a quarter century earlier in the Treaty of Versailles. And out of this comes the United Nations. Now, these are Christians, but as I say, they're allied to the political establishment. And they create the, and you studied this when you did history, I assume in high school, the failed League of Nations, the collapse of that, and then the rise of the UN, and the UN which has taken its place. The question is the status quo now, then just envisaged as the reality, is it actually a viable response to the crisis of a totalitarian view of life? Has it addressed the problem of human nature most specifically? Does it account for the spiritual and physical and familial and cultural context of humanity? Does it account for that? Can a Christian, without any reservation, support that? Anyway, that's the context, 1943, very interesting. So those are some Christian thinkers, the establishment Christian. But, and here I read on, the thoughts of certain other Christian thinkers followed a different course. On the very day that the Casablanca conference began, Jacques Maritain gave the first of his 4 Terry lectures at Yale University. His subject, this is the title, Education at the Crossroads. The next day, January 15th, W.H. Auden delivered a lecture to the students of Swarthmore College called, quote, Vocation and Society. His concern was to explore the power of liberal education to prepare young people to assume responsible and meaningful callings in a world that needed their skills. At the same time, across the Atlantic, in the city of Newcastle, C.S. Lewis, for the University of Durham, was preparing to give a set of lectures he would later call The Abolition of Man, or reflections on education with special reference to the teaching of English in the upper forms of schools. This emphasis on education was shared by the French refugee Simone Weil, W-I-E-L, who had recently moved to London, where she devoted the last months of her life to an impassioned plea for the reconstitution of European culture. To this plea, she gave the title enracinement, enracinement, rather, rootedness, or as it would later be called in English, the need for roots. And elsewhere in the great English metropolis, the American-born poet T.S. Eliot had just completed his poetic testament in Little Gidding, the last of his 4 quartets, and having sought the spiritual peace that comes from the faith that, quote, all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well, now turned his attention in a series of essays published in that January and February to what he called the definition of culture. So all of these Christian intellectuals, Jacques Maritain, a famous Catholic writer, involved here in the University of Toronto and so forth, W.H. Auden, famous American poet, C.S. Lewis, and Simone Weil, and T.S. Eliot, all writing in 1943 with that backdrop, with that problem in mind, and presenting a very different view than I think you get in the establishment. And I'm not saying that no Christians were involved. I said, on the contrary, Christians were involved, but they're rather critical of the attempt to solve the problem politically when it's a bigger problem than politics. Politicians want to do political. What do you expect? It's the context of war. Politicians have a lot of power during a world war when they can literally rewrite the map and decide what's going to happen. They have maximal power. They're going to use a crisis to push to their advantage. Now, if it's the case, if you've read C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, that the establishment view actually abolishes man, is the consensus of the politicians going to acknowledge and address the problem of human nature that Lewis raises? Or is it going to act and perpetuate that problem? It's a rhetorical question because they are going to perpetuate the problem. They haven't really seen the deep roots of the problem of alienation. It's not just a political problem. It's not just a military problem. It's not just an economic problem. It's a spiritual problem. It's a problem of a culture that has turned its back on Christ. And the 20th century is clearly a time of widespread departures from the church, whether Catholic or Protestant. And at the same time, I think there are voices that you can hear speaking against that backdrop, which offer an alternative view. And I think Lewis and Tolkien are the foremost amongst them, and that's what we're looking at. That's why we're looking at this on the course. And that's why I read that whole, I think it's helpful to have that backdrop. It's not just Lewis and Tolkien. It's those individuals I just mentioned, again, most of which you will never read about in the public universities. You just won't hear of them. And they deserve, I think, a hearing because they say something different. And they are addressing not just the issues of education, but culture. What does it mean to have a culture? What's a good, healthy culture? How do we think about that? We could add others to that mix. There is Christopher Dawson, the Catholic historian. Christopher Dawson's The Judgment of the Nations, 1942. There is F.R. Leavis's Education in the University, a sketch for the English School, 1943. We could have Dorothy Sayers' Begin Here, a wartime essay, written in 1940. We could have Walter Moberly's The Crisis in the University, 1949. All sorts of different writers looking at their world in terms of a crisis that needs to be looked at in a Christian and spiritual fashion. So I'm just saying this, we tend to, even in the Christian world, only read Mr. Tolkien and Mr. Lewis speaking to this issue because they're the best or most popular. They manage to tap into this feeling that there needs to be more said on the issues that blight humanity, and Lewis and Tolkien write on it particularly well. But I didn't want to give you the sense that they're two men all on their own. As I say, Lewis gets the platform to speak on the BBC radio because there are other Christians that think that we need to hear this in the public conversation. And Tolkien is encouraged by Lewis and others in his Inklings talks to carry on with his, seemingly arcane or rather archaic interests in ancient languages and creation of fantasy worlds by other Christians, because the Inklings are full of Christians, thinking there's something spiritually powerful about the stories of the Lord of the Rings that addresses the contemporary situation. And you'll know that when you read the Lord of the Rings, it sounds like some of it sounds like trench warfare. You're in the marshes, the Deadlands, is where there's bodies in the water and so forth. Tolkien would have seen, and Lewis would have seen the bodies lying in the muck, decomposing, the dead marshes and so forth. It's a memory that he's evoking there as much as anything, of a world that is at war and in which life appears to have no value. And a war is going on by great powers that seem hostile to all of life and want to bring it under the dominion of one thing, one entity. So that's the general backdrop. I'm just trying to cast a sort of an image in your mind's eye at the beginning of the significance of the course, not just as a literature course, but really as a cultural assessment, which I think we can use ourselves as we think about our own culture, which suffers from the same divorce, the great divorce of the spiritual and the material with respect to human nature. They hyper-spiritualize it or hyper-materialize it. In the discipline of psychology, they address most mental health issues now through chemicals. You're given a pill. That's a chemical problem to mental health issues. Of course, it's going to have some effect because a human being has a brain, and a brain is a physical object and it responds to chemical intervention. But is that all that is involved in psychology? Well, it depends on your definition of psychology and what you mean by the psyche. The psychologists can't agree what the psyche is. The materialists say it's the brain. The more spiritual end of things will just say it's the thinking self. That's more the Freudian end of things. It's more the verbal end of things rather than the material. Note that in the incarnation, the word becomes flesh. Very important. So logotherapy, which I think is very helpful, is connected to the incarnation in physical human existence in Christian theology. And that marriage is divorced in the 20th century. And we still live in the light of that great divorce. And Lewis writes the great divorce, but applies it to heaven and hell. But here I'm suggesting it's in relation to human nature even. There's a marriage that's gone on of the spirit and mind and body in Christian theology in its view of human nature, which has been broken apart by modern science. And our heroes, Mr. Lewis and Tolkien, mine at any rate, are addressing that in, I think, profound ways. So I'm going to begin, and I'm not going to do what I said here and address this work on science fiction right now. I'm just going to have you read it. I'm not going to read through it for you, but what's interesting to see, well, I can summarize it briefly. Lewis talks about varieties of science fiction, things that are under the umbrella of science fiction, and dismiss certain types of science fiction as of no interest to him whatsoever. And the one that he ends up landing upon is the type, and this is why Lewis and Tolkien will connect, is the type that addresses what historically is called fantasy. Dealing with spiritual beings, whether they're trolls or dwarfs or elves, that sort of thing. That fires Lewis's imagination. That sort of science fiction he's intensely interested in. So we're going to take the spiritual, moral world of fauns and dryads and nymphs and gods, and we're going to push that into the framework of this age of science, and now we'll put them into extraterrestrials. That's the type of science fiction I'm interested in. So it's fantasy in other worlds. That's all it is. The same sort of thing that Lewis is interested, or Tolkien is interested in his work when he projects these beings, elves and so forth, and puts them in his fiction. Lewis is doing the exact same thing, but he's putting it particularly and conspicuously in that form of writing that we call science fiction. Tolkien keeps it in fantasy, but they're still speaking to the same contemporary political dynamic. They're both concerned with that. That's going to be my argument on the course. They're addressing the same thing, but they address it from a different vantage point. So we'll look at that, and that's effectively all I wanted to have you read on science fiction. By all means, read it there. But it is effectively, as I just say, he goes through the different varieties of science fiction, says, I'm not interested in that one or that one or that one or that one, but this one. This is the one I am interested in. And then he proceeds to write one that's a fantasy type. And so we'll include that. So next class, I'm going to come to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, which I think is a good way to begin the genre, because Mary Shelley is aware of the problem of modern science looking at human nature as something that it can dominate and control and tinker with and play God with. Literally, when we talk about scientists playing God, Frankenstein is the first genre that comes to mind, first book. People think about that. It's well expressed. And again, Shelley casts it, has the monster itself, or the creature, read Paradise Lost and reflect on the relation of him to the scientist as compared to Adam relating to God. And he laments that he doesn't have a God that cares for him the way Adam did. So it's an interesting reflection. And it's a thought that, again, Shelley is thinking about in terms of contemporary bioethics. Does the modern scientist care about the patient? Remember, the word patient is from the Latin to suffer. A patient suffers the action of the doctor. It doesn't mean that they're literally suffering, but they are passive. They don't have any say. They're being acted upon. The ethical response to this comes in the Nuremberg Code in the 20th century, which is that you have to give informed consent to medical experiments. But that's a late emerging doctrine, which was thrown aside during COVID, by the way. But I won't get into too much politics, as I said. But informed consent went the way of the dodo. Is it come back? Can it come back? If you can waive it under the conditions that you think are sufficiently serious, then it's not ethics at all. Because there's a condition in which we can waive your informed consent under the auspices of keeping you safe. That's sufficient then, because the threat is sufficient, presumably. Anyway, so those are raised in Shelley's Frankenstein. I think it's a really good backdrop for thinking about the genre of science fiction and the problems raised by science fiction, even in these two authors who are in no way Christian in their view of things. And you will read both of these, and particularly Shelley, in the public universities. Shelley represents Romanticism in its view of life. So I'll talk about that next time. I'm just doing an overview right now. Then we'll move on to H.G. Wells' First Men in the Moon, and we'll see a view of the cosmos presented there that Lewis wants to address, and views of what the lunar life is like. What are these beings like? And to not give it all away, they have evolved into specialization. So certain creatures have really monstrous heads and very little by way of bodies, and others have huge bodies, physically able to do certain tasks. So they developed in that way, specialization. The heads are divorced from the bodies, in other words. And what I think Wells is suggesting here is that modern intellectual life has effectively done the same thing. It's divorced the laborers from the intellectuals. And the laborers can be, you would further say, the value of their labor can be cast aside if you can create machinery that will replicate or do better what the laborers do. Then those people who are doing the laboring are effectively dispensable. We don't need them anymore. We can send them into the trenches in mass slaughter, you might want to say. So we'll do that. And then I want to read some of the essays that I mentioned at the very last class of the C.S. Lewis course that I just taught, but not everyone took that course. I want to go to membership, two kinds of equality, the weight of glory, transposition, and even you might want to read that here, or you can read it when we come to That Hideous Strength, The Inner Ring. Just a series of essays, and when you read these essays, you will find that what Lewis is addressing here in the essays are borne out in his fiction. It's very helpful to bear that in mind. And then we'll get to Lewis's response to the First Man on the Moon proper. Out of the Silent Planet, we'll take 2 classes. Paralandra, which is set on Venus, we'll take 3 classes. That Hideous Strength, we get their reading break. That Hideous Strength, 3 more takes at it. They get progressively longer, by the way, sort of like J.K. Rowling's. Just keep getting bigger and bigger. Fortunately, he didn't write 7. So who knows what it would have looked like at that point. Just keep blowing up. And then we'll make the shift to Tolkien. So we will first go to his Mythopoeia, which is addressing the issue of the relation of myth to creation and the idea of the true myth. That is the concept that converts Lewis to Christianity. It's one of the decisive moments. Mythopoeia is a sort of essay form response to Lewis particularly. I could put it at the middle, but I'm trying to break up Lewis and Tolkien, because I think this work is hugely influential on all of Lewis's writing. So it's sort of chronologically out of space, but I'm just throwing it to make the shift from Tolkien to Lewis, or Lewis to Tolkien rather. Then we'll look at his own literary theory and his notion of subcreation. I won't get into that right now. You'll hear enough on me then at that point. But we'll look at his work on fairy stories and on a little work called Leaf by Niggle. Brilliant little story about the artist and the role of the artist and the responsibility of the artist in his art and the relative insignificance of the artist, spiritually speaking. So there's a humility about Lewis and Tolkien's endeavors which you don't see in the establishment. The establishment wants to control everything and thinks they can control everything, and they should control everything. Lewis and Tolkien believe it's their responsibility to address the issues, but don't think that they actually have the power, nor should have the power, to have full control over society. We don't want a Christian orchestrating every aspect of human existence. We already have a God who does that. He doesn't need help in orchestrating world affairs. We play our part, but it's not governing all things, as some would think. That's the threat. That is the scenario given to Gandalf. You can rule. You can replace Saruman. You can be Sauron's right-hand man here. You can actually, if you seize the ring, you're a sufficient threat that you can become the great lord. Same thing with Galadriel. They're given the ring of power. It's right within Galadriel's grasp. If she takes the ring, she has the power to wield it and destroy Sauron. So it's a real scenario that Tolkien is presenting as a thought experiment. What if a good character is given that sort of power? What will they do with it? Because they're good, they recognize their own fallibility, and their own goodness is not sufficient to wield it. And so they won't do it, which is presented as a heroic act and a very difficult one, a spiritual act and so forth. But we'll get into that when the time. But we'll go through Tolkien, then the Fellowship, the Two Towers, and then the Return of the King. Unfortunately, I got cut short there on the Return of the King, which is sort of horrible. But anyway, these are all going to bleed into one anyway, truthfully. When I get to the Lord of the Rings, I'm going to be trying to deal with them roughly chronologically, and then I'm going to give it up, and I'm going to start going all over the place. It won't take too long either. I'll wreck what I've put down as my agenda here, but I'll try and stick to the beginning and slowly work through it. And I'll, as I say, I don't know how long it will last. Not too long, it's fair to say. Because when I get to the Portrait of Evil in The Lord of the Rings, then I'm going to have to deal, the Portrait of Evil, I'm going to have to deal with Sauron. And I'll have to deal with Mount Doom. And of course, I'm not going to be talking about the Fellowship only then. Right? So I'm thinking of the whole book. Anyway. So the assessment is by means of 2 essays and the usual exam. So that's the general gist of the course. And these are the required texts. And do you have any questions about this? First class. So we're not actually into the stuff yet. But next class, we'll get right into Shelley's Frankenstein. No? Okay, it's an exciting course. Yes?
Thank you. When you were referring to the establishment, could you clarify that?
Well, I take the establishment to be the political leaders that are meeting in the Casablanca conference. So the Churchill, the Roosevelt, all the political leaders that are meeting in the Casablanca conference thinking about how we are going to govern the world going forward. The political powers that are talking about what are we going to do, the collapse of the League of Nations in 1919 led to, in their mind, the Second World War, because we didn't resolve that. So we have to learn lessons from that, and we need something like a League of Nations. So they reconstitute it, they create the United Nations, and that is now the establishment. It's an establishment that exists across national lines. We're going to collaborate together, and we have certain things that we view in commonality. Now, the first documents in the UN, by the way, tend to be better than the ones that are created later. I mean, there are early declarations on the rights of the child and so forth, and declarations on human nature and on oppression and so forth, which are rather good. But over the course of time, you'll note that the UN it loses its raison d'etre, and it starts to gain the problems of the power of the ring, shall we say, which are just the corruptions of power and the loss of, and again, even from the outset, as I said, as Lewis addressed it, they don't even have a sense that human moral nature is actually a real thing that they need to be guided by. They don't recognize the Tao. That's a big problem. You're not going to end up in the right place if you don't start from the right presuppositions. Even if you did, would the UN be and the idea of global government, would that be a good idea? Granted, the threat seems big, especially with the atom bomb. That's a big threat that requires a big stick to address. Is the response the right one? And even if it is the right one, is it going to solve the problems perpetually so that the UN decides the best course for the UN, or at what point does the UN become part of the problem? Maybe you need to break it down and start it up again a different way with different realities in mind, the ones that are in our current world, technological world, the one of using the internet and social media and conversing through electronic devices and so forth, which tend to put to nullity the significance of embodied human existence. It's a virtual reality. Did the UN ever envisage that problem? The problem of technology and circumventing local, material, human communities? Because technology now does that. And can the UN solve that problem? Or does it tend to exacerbate that problem with its big picture, one-size-fits-all approach? Anyway, these are questions. I'm not going to answer the questions. I'm saying the questions are raised in the work and they prompt our thought and reflection. Okay, any other questions at this point? You have lots of, if you've not been in my classes, I talk nonstop, so you have to put up your hand and ask me a question and interrupt me. And I'm very happy to go down that path then, because I'm skipping over a lot of things that will be of interest. I might say, I was just about to address that, hold on, just wait a second, I'm going to get there. But often I'll follow a different path, and I welcome that, so please interrupt me. Okay? Good, well then I'm done for today,